Okay. Hope this is working. All right. So what I wanted to do, just continue to chapter 3. What I'm hoping. So one of the things that I took from chapter 2 was that the charge that class struggle tends to receive, which is that it's too reductionist and it doesn't account for things like race or rent gender or not, oppression between states, for example. It seems to be encompassing all of that, and so it's not a reductionist thing. So, but I'm still unsure how to best cash it out. So I'm not sure this is what this next chapter is gonna do, but I'm hoping it will. Let's see. So the next chapter is a protracted positive sum struggle. First section is universal leveling or great divergence, obsolescence of war, an eternal conflict between masters and slaves, the proletariat class interest and its transcendence, Marx against Nietzsche and Foucault. Okay. Well, doesn't seem like it, but maybe this particular, you know, the idea of like, is it just a matter of fighting against Dominion, right? Dominion of others in some way. But this should be interesting. Um, the Nietzsche part. Okay, well let's just I'm just gonna start reading and see how it goes and see how far we get. All right, so section 1, let me just hide this. The oh shit. The Communist Manifesto theorizes class struggle on the basis of an analysis of what's wrong with me today? Of an analysis of the bourgeois society that was increasingly becoming established in the West. So theorizes a class struggle on the basis of the bourgeois society was okay. But had such a view not already been refuted by the disappearance of the ancien regime, organized as it was into a stable, naturalized fixed estates, and its replacement by social order characterized by social mobility? Oh my gosh. I apologize. I'm like way off today. So it's asking, but had such a view not already been refuted by the disappearance of the ancien regime, organized as it was into stable, naturally fixed estates, and its replacement by social order characterized by social mobility? In Tocqueville's view, the advent of industrial democratic society renders struggles belonging to a superseded social stage obsolete. Democracy in America asserts that castes disappear and the class of society draw together. In fact, so to speak, there are no longer any classes. At least as regards the West, they belong to the past, and in an event, societies where the members of a community are divided into castes and classes were destined to fade away. This was not a prediction formulated solely with the view of the USA, a country without a long feudal past behind it. In fact, we're dealing with the sociological analysis conjoined with a discourse in the philosophy of history. According to the French liberal, from the 11th century onward, a twofold revolution in the state society had been underway in the West. Indeed, it is, quote, the noble has gone down the social ladder, and the commoner has gone up. The one descends, and the other rises. Every half century brings them nearer to each other, and they will soon meet, end quote. Well, that didn't happen. Anyways, everything was working in concert to this end. Now, not only landed wealth, but also personal property could confer influence and power. This already served to undermine the privileges and domination of the aristocracy. Along with property in its various forms, the quote exercise of the intellect became a source of strength and wealth, so that every discourse in the arts, every improvement in commerce and manufactures created so many new elements of equality among men. End quote. All the various factors of the modern world, quote, seem to cooperate to enrich the poor and impoverish the rich, end quote. In conclusion, the tendency towards a universal leveling was irreversible. It could not be blocked or even slowed down, especially given that the wealthy were few and powerless. Jesus. And therefore incapable of mounting effective resistance. There was no doubt that a higher will was presiding over this. Quote, the gradual development of the principle of equality is a providential fact. It has all the chief characteristics of such a fact. It is universal, it is lasting, it is constable, it constantly eludes all human interference, all events as well as all men contribute to its progress. End quote. The passages I have just cited are from volumes 1 and 2 of Democracy in America and thus date 1835 and 1840, respectively. In subsequent years, with his focus on France and Britain, Tocqueville drew a significantly different picture. Quote, equality is gradually extending its dominion everywhere except industry, which is organized in ever more aristocratic and hierarchical form. A relationship of strict dependency bound the wage worker to the employer. As regards both power relations and the distribution of social wealth, equality was far off. The organized forces of multitude produced for the benefit of one man. End quote. In some, quote, here the slave, there the master, here the wealth of a few, there the poverty of the overwhelming majority. End quote. Lying in wait were slave wars. Initially ignored, the reality of social classes and social classes ready to square up in a trial of strength makes its abrupt appearance. Now it is no longer equality, but precisely inequality that has been sanctioned by a higher will. As emerging as emerges from the polemic against the economic and political theories, which would have us believe that human misfortunes are the effects of law and not of providence, and that poverty can be abolished by changing the social order. This is so later work by Tocqueville. Okay. No, oh no, it doesn't have backlink. Mhm. Well, I haven't been doing the footnotes too often. Okay. However, publishing the 12th edition of Democracy in America immediately after the 1848 revolution, Tocqueville reiterated the viewpoint expressed 15 years earlier about the irresistible and providential character of the march of equality in the USA and the West as a whole. But how can the thesis of the impoverishment of the wealthy and enrichment of the poor be reconciled with the warring against social polarization so stark as to elicit fears about the eruption of slave wars? It remains the case that the French liberal refused to query the view that universal leveling was impending in the West. Initially ignored and then occasionally conceded, the reality of classes in the class struggle was now, in a sense, repressed. In fact, this repression, manifestly prompted by a political concern to cushion and contain the resentment of the subaltern classes, sounds like an involuntary confirmation. The surviving power of wealth, notwithstanding the eclipse of the Ancien regime, was also clearly underestimated by J.S. Mill, who in 1861 expressed concern that seems very strange today. He feared that with the extension of the suffrage of the working class, much more widespread and numerous in Britain than in the USA, might win an electoral majority and utilize it for the purposes of substituting the class ascendancy of the poor for that of the rich. The government of the numerical majority will end up enacting class legislation in the sense that it would sanction collective despotism or the uncontested power of a majority of the poor over the minority of the wealthy. To avert this danger, Mill recommended plural voting by those deemed more intelligent and those who perform more demanding tasks, for example, entrepreneurs. This would enable the rich to preserve a presence, albeit an exegesis one, in representative bodies. The English liberal reached the same conclusion as Tocqueville. The wealthy person was now isolated and impotent. Hence, the class struggle of the proletariat was either superfluous or a harbinger of disaster. Although entangling himself in serious contradictions, Tocqueville prophesied the advent of universal leveling in the West. At the same time, he registered and rejoiced at the gulf be, being created between the West and the rest of the world. The relationship that made a few million men Westerners, the rulers of the whole species, was manifestly preordained in the province on the provisions of Providence. Similarly, while he cautioned against a process of democratization so far advanced in the West as to condemn wealth to isolation and impotence, Mill celebrated the vigorous despotism exercised internationally by the West. Far from being negative, this relationship of extreme inequality must be extended to embrace the whole globe. It is, quote, already common and is rapidly intending to become the universal condition by more backward populations, to be held indirect subjugation by the more advanced, end quote. The extremely unequal relationship prevailing internationally did not only concern the distribution of political and military power. Tocqueville wrote, quote, the discovery of America opened 1,000 new paths to fortune and led obscure adventurers to wealth and power, end quote. The same motivation might impel French citizens to transfer to the colonies and in particular Algeria. Quote, to get inhabitants to come to such a country, it is first of all necessary to offer them great opportunities to make their fortune. The most fertile and best irrigated land must be reserved for them, end quote. In this way, colonial expansion in American Algeria gener- generated remarkable social mobility, opening up access to wealth even to individuals of popular extraction, thereby confirming the process of universal leveling. But this was only one side of the coin. It was the French liberal himself who acknowledged that as a result of the process of colonization, the Arab population in Algeria was literally dying of hunger, while the Native Americans were on the point of being wiped off the face of the earth. That is, if it reduced inequalities in the metropolis and within the white community, the enrichment of adventurers and colonists created an ever wider gulf between conquistadors and subject peoples. Constantly and exclusively adopting the standpoint of the Christian world or the West, Tocqueville did not appreciate the nexus between these contradictory aspects of a single phenomenon and was never induced to problematize his view of the irresistible march of equality of conditions and the disappearance not only of castes but also of classes. The Communist Manifesto seems to answer the two liberal authors. Quote, the modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones, end quote. Indeed, with voting rights having been obtained by the popular masses and the abolition of censitary discrimination, wealth lost its immediate political significance, but could henceforth precisely celebrate its triumph. Mass poverty now pertained to a private sphere where public power had no right to intervene. This was a triumph which the capitalist bourgeoisie could also celebrate internationally, giving impetus to colonial expansion and enslaving and decimating entire populations. By way of confirmation of the irresistible tendency to universal leveling and equality between commoner and noble, Tocqueville asserted that literature became an arsenal open to all. The German ideology argues very differently. Quote, the class which has the means of material production at its disposal consequently also controls the means of mental production, so that the idea of those who lack the means of mental production are on the whole subject to it. End quote. Hmm. I think we might get into Foucault here, based on this particular idea of the means of mental production. Um, what I'm because I understand some of the Marxist critique of people like Foucault is that they are a product of that mental production and such are in a way it's just another way of maintaining the status quo. And even though they pretend to be radical, they tend to not be at a more fundamental level. That's something like that, as I understand to be their criticism of people like Foucault. So it would be interesting to see that's where he heads with that, or if I'm way off. Okay, resuming. Far from being synonymous with universal leveling, the bourgeois revolution involved the accentuation of inequalities at many levels. Internationally, what has been called the Great Divergence between the prosperous West and the rest of the planet derived from it. In 1820, China, for centuries or millennia, eminently placed in the development of human civilization, still boasted a GDP amounting of 32.4% of the world GDP, while, quote, Chinese life expectancy and thus nutrition was at roughly English levels, and so above continental ones. Even in the late 1700s, at the time of its foundation, the People's Republic of China was the poorest country in the world, or among the poorest. The history of India is not very different. In 1820, it still accounted for 15.7% of global GDP before likewise succumbing to desperate poverty. I think I said quote at some point, but I didn't end it. Or maybe, oh, wait, I'm confused. Sorry. Hold on. There's a quote here, and then in 1820. Okay, so I think it's this one. It's like quote while Chinese blah 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 blah. Sorry, I'm like OCDing so hard today. Um, I am not seeing it. Might be a mistake. 'Cause, okay, so this one starts here. So while quote Chinese life expectancy and thus nutrition was at roughly English levels, even in the late 1700s, at the same time of its foundation, the People's Republic of China was the poorest country in the world. Well, I guess we didn't end it. Might be a mistake here that I'm just okay. Or I'm really blind. Oh my God, it's gonna bug me so much. Da, 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 da. All right, I'm just okay. I apologize. I'm in 1820. It still accounted for 15.7% of the global GDP before likewise succumbing to desperate poverty. This is a process that can be understood starting from Marx and the section of Capital devoted to primitive accumulation, but which is far beyond the range of Tocqueville, who tended to offer an apologetic description of the world he inhabited. In any event, far from rendering class struggle obsolete through universal leveling, bourgeois society aggravated national and international inequalities, which can only be contested through class struggle. Yeah, that'll. I'm kind of losing. Maybe have to go back, but I'm kind of losing the thread of okay. So what we mean by class struggle now? Um, it's kind of I'm not understanding it yet. Anyways, section two, obsolescence of war. With the advent of industrial democracy, it is the phenomenon of war destined to disappear along with class struggle. Kant's hope that the end of the ancien regime and the patrimonial conception of the state will lead to an international order marked by peace were dashed by the post-Thermidorian and Napoleonic wars. But they seem to enjoy a new lease of life after the July Revolution, with the fading of the antagonisms between France and Britain and the consolidation of the Pax Britannica. This is the context in which to locate Tocqueville's thesis that modern democracy society lacks the objective basis for war. even if the ambition of military men of modest social origin, eager to forge a career distinguishing themselves on the battlefield, invariably played a role. Other authors, rather than assigning it to the representative regime, entrusted the realization of the ideal of perpetual peace to the development of industrial and commercial society. The world marked The world market supposedly renders state and national borders less significant and bound peoples in ever closer, ultimately indissoluble links of interest, mutual respect, and friendship. Such was the argument of Benjamin Constant and above all of Herbert Spencer. At the time, at times, the Communist Manifesto betrays the influence of this discourse. Quote, national differences and antagonisms are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the modes of production, and in the conditions of life corresponding thereto. End quote. It seemed to attest to a waning of the phenomenon of war in the wake of the development of capitalism, without having to wait for communism. Quote, in proportion as the antagonism between classes within the nation vanishes, the hostility of one nation to another will come to an end. End quote. On the other hand, it is the manifesto which, as we know, rejects the harmonious vision that would today be called the process of globalization. A similar oscillation runs through a speech made by Marx in Brussels in January 1848. Free trade, quote, tears down the few national barriers which still restrict the free development of capital, end quote, leaving space for nothing but the, quote, antagonisms of proletariat and bourgeoisie, end quote, which paves the way for the social revolution. However, the same speech contains the assertion that free trade accentuates contradictions internationally as well. Quote, we have shown what sort of fraternity free trade begets between the different classes of one and the same nation. The fraternity which free trade would establish between the nation of the earth would not be more real. To call it cosmopolitan exploitation universal brotherhood is an idea that could only be engendered in the brain of the bourgeoisie. End quote. This became Marx and Engels' settled view. Only a few months later, the can't pronounce that, criticized Arnold Rouge for not having understood that the phenomenon of war did not, in fact, disappear with the feudal regime. Rather than being natural allies, countries where the bourgeoisie was dominant were divided by ruthless competition, the outcome of which could be war. Such competition also aimed at the spoliation of colonial peoples. Notwithstanding Spencer's contrary opinion, the advent of industrial capitalist society did not betoken the disappearance of war as a tool of enrichment. It sufficed to glance at piratical wars and piratical expeditions against China, Cochin China, and so forth. Far from being synonymous with the peaceful development, capital subsequently stressed the capitalist system involved brute force. Conjoined with wars of enslavement and even extermination against barbarians were rivalry and conflict in the civilized world between the great powers, who were the protagonists and beneficiaries of colonial expansion and spoliation. Overall, what characterized capitalism was the commercial war of the European nations, the globe with the globe for a theater. It begins with the revolt of the Netherlands from Spain, assumes giant dimensions in England's anti-Jacobin War, and is still going on in the Opium Wars against China. End quote. The commercial war of the European nations recalls the industrial war of extermination between nations alluded to by the manifesto. In any event, the historical period from the emergence of Holland, the first country to shake off the yoke of the ancient regime, to the rise of liberal and imperial Great Britain was quite the reverse of a prelude to the advent of perpetual peace. Uh, Hold on, I'm running out of battery. One moment. okay. For war to be eradicated, it was not enough for one exploiting class to replace another. As in the bourgeois revolution, the system of exploitation and oppression, domestic and global, must be eliminated in its entirety. This is the sense in which, in July 1870, taking a position on the Franco-German War that had broken out, a text written by Marx for the International Working Men's Association called for a struggle for a, quote, a new society whose international rule will be peace, because its national ruler will be everywhere be the same, labor, end quote. This analysis is virtually contemporaneous with that of J.S. Mill, who celebrated the British Empire as a, quote, step towards universal peace and general friendly cooperation among nations, end quote. In support of this thesis, a peculiar argument is advanced. The gigantic federation that was the British Empire embodied the cause of liberty and international morality to a greater extent than quote any other great nation seemed to conceive as possible or recognizable as desirable, end quote. Hence, backward populations had an interest in becoming part of it, so as to avoid, quote, being absorbed into a foreign state and becoming a source of additional aggressive strength to some rival power, end quote. Homage to universal peace fails to conceal the reality of colonial wars, set to absorb this or that colony, and the rivalry which was a harbinger for a large-scale wars between Great Britain, celebrated as the embodiment of the cause of peace, and some rival power suspected of the warring design of seeking to enhance its aggressive strength. While Mill sought to demonstrate the disappearance of war on the basis of the imperialist rivalry actually primates, Tocqueville, in the very title of a key chapter in Volume 2 of Democracy in America, claimed that great revolutions will become more rare, end quote. In the event, century, in the event, the century and a half since such predictions were ventured represent what is perhaps the historical period richest in wars and revolutions. And now let us read Marx. A few years after the publication of the text just cited in a letter of December 28, 1846, starting from the conflict between the productive forces already acquired by man and his social relations, which no longer correspond to those productive forces. He evoked the terrible wars now imminent between the various classes of nation and between the various nations. Shortly thereafter, the Communist Manifesto discerned on the horizon either proletarian revolutions or agrarian revolutions as a precondition of national emancipation against an order that exuded violence not only because it was based on social and national oppression, but also because it secreted the danger of competition between the various capitalist bourgeoisies issuing in a catastrophic confrontation. On the basis of the theory of class struggle, Marx was in a sense able to foresee the upheavals of the 20th century. Okay. Hmm. I keep going. Yeah, we got plenty of gas left in the tank, I think. 3. An eternal conflict between masters and slaves. Adequately to understand Marx's theory of class struggle, it is not enough to distinguish it from the thesis of those who regard the end of the ancien regime as the start of the disappearance or dramatic reduction of socio-political conflict at home and abroad. In a famous letter in March 5th, 1852, Marx observed, "As for myself, I do not claim to have discovered either the existence of class in modern society or the struggle between them. In their different ways, bourgeois historians and economists had spoken of it long before him. The true novelty of historical materialism lay in its assertion of the historically determined and transient character of societies based on class struggle and class domination." The date is the mid 19th century. In the light of the subsequent developments, we might undertake a comparison with other authors. While the Communist Manifesto referred to class struggle, Nietzsche likewise saw a struggle between estates and classes unfolding in history. While the authors of the manifesto repeatedly compared and juxtaposed modern wage slavery with black slavery on several occasions, both Nietzsche and across the Atlantic, the ideologues of the slaveholding South argued in similar vein with a view to demonstrating the inanity of the abolitionist project. If in Marx and Engels' view, capitalist society had substituted modern slavery for medieval serfdom, which had in its time supplanted the slavery proper of classical antiquity, for Nietzsche in Europe and the southern ideologues of the USA, the servile subject of labor was essential, ineliminable foundation of civilization. In the words of arguably the most illustrious of them, John C. Calhoun, quote, "I hold then that there never has yet existed a wealthy and civilized society in which one portion of the community did not, in point of fact, live on the labor of the other. There is, and always has been, in an advanced stage of wealth or civilization, a conflict between labor and capital." End quote. Struggle between estates and classes, the permanence of slavery, even the social order that has formally abolished it, conflict between labor and the capital, the conceptual analogies do not stop there. In Nietzsche, we find two more categories of Marxian discourse. He refers to the surplus labor, extracted from slaves and workers who are thereby subject to exploitation. Where then are the differences? In the in the theories of aristocratic radicalism, the extortion of surplus labor and exploitation are the expressions of a general, irrepressible tendency of natural and social reality of life as such. It should be added that in Marx and Engels, not only can slavery in all its forms be overcome, but these forms are not equivalent. Already, it should be added that in Marx and Engels, not only can slavery in all its forms be overcome, but these forms are not equivalent. Already in the early writings, they criticized the Jacobins for having confused the real slavery of the ancient world with the emancipated slavery of the modern world. The adjective certainly does not cancel the substantive and yet is not devoid of significance either. We subsequently saw in the poverty of his philosophy, denouncing that, as it were, masked slavery prevalent in Europe. The mask referring to here is like the appearance referred to in Hegel's logic, which expresses a level of reality, albeit a superficial one. We can now understand why, on the outbreak of the American Civil War, Marx and Engels took a clear position in favor of the Union. From the outset, they urged it to wage a revolutionary war against the South to abolish black slavery. And yet, in the North, the slavery to which wage labor was subjected was alive and well. The slavery to which capital, taking up the Declaration of General Congress of Labor at Baltimore, defined as capitalistic slavery. The fact is that the indirect slavery of whites in Britain was not the same thing as the direct slavery of black men on the other side of the Atlantic. The direct forced labor imposed on the slave could not be equated with the indirect economic coercion to which the worker, the at least formerly free laborer, was subject. In fact, when the Civil War exploded in the USA, and there was no shortage of sympathizers with the South in Europe, Marx was concerned to avoid any ambiguity. Shelving traditional denunciation of the indirect slavery inherent in the capitalist system, he repeatedly called for a struggle to defend the system of free labor against the system of slavery. Certainly, Engels observed in 1885, with the end of the Civil War, an attempt was made to replace open Negro slavery with the disguised slavery of Indian and Chinese coolies. Here, in the context of a discussion of the slavery affecting labor to different degrees, we find a dual differentiation. On the one hand, there is a distinction between open and disguised forms of slavery, respectively imposed on blacks and Indians and Chinese, but always on colonial populations or populations with colonial origins. On the other, in the capitalist metropolis, the struggle for the reduction and regulation of the working day seems to have attenuated what remained slave-like in the conditions of labor in capitalist society, and be capable of further attenuating it. Here in Nietzsche, as in Calhoun, we can indeed find key categories of Marxist discourse. In the latter, however, analysis of the conflict between capital and labor is a history of progressive emancipation of labor which albeit partially does occur, which it is possible to achieve through class struggle in the framework of existing society. In Nietzsche, by contrast, the conflict is schematically reduced, sometimes heavily naturalistic sense, outside any concrete historical dialectic, to the antagonism eternally pitting masters and slaves against one another. Consequently, the class struggle of those who are subject to slavery in its ancient or modern open or disguised form, the revolt of a barbaric caste of slaves, cannot accomplish any real emancipation, but only mean disaster for civilization. Yeah, that so there's definitely that in Nietzsche, and um it's really interesting what um like gets ignored a lot, especially people that might consider themselves leftist Nietzscheans, where I mean he's so it's something that they need to. I don't know. I just don't think you can get to ignore it. Like he's in some sense he's saying emancipation is not achievable unless it's complete disaster. So I don't know. I don't know. There's definitely a problem there that you can't just pave over. I don't think. That's just my uninformed opinion, I guess. Anyways, one more section, I think. Four. The proletariat, class interest, and its transcendence. In Marx and Engels, not only is there no eternal clash between masters and slaves, but the latter, definitively abolishing social relations based on domination and exploitation, create an order which, from a strategic perspective, yields richer, more fulfilling forms of existence for the ex-masters as well. Let's first see what happens to the development of the productive forces. By terminating the crisis of the overproduction characteristic of the bourgeois society, the socialist revolution promotes the development of the productive forces. The proletarian is the first, most direct beneficiary of the suppression of a system that seeks to transform him or her into an ascetic but productive slave. But she is not the sole beneficiary of the overall growth in social wealth. Of particular importance is what occurs intellectually and morally. The economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 stress that the capitalist system involves the dehumanization of the agents of the exploitation of labor. Quote, production does not simply produce man as a commodity, the human commodity, man in the role of commodity. It produces him in keeping with its role as mentally and physically dehumanized being. Immorality, deformity, and dulling of the worker and capitalist. End quote. Along with the exploited, the process of stupefaction and commodification ends up engulfing the exploiters themselves. This is a thesis reiterated in The Holy Family. Quote, the property class and the class of proletariat present the same human self-entrenchment, but the former class feels at ease and strengthened in this self-entrenchment. It recognizes entrenchment as its own power and has in its semblance of human existence. The latter feels annihilated in entrenchment. It sees in its own powerlessness and the reality of an inhuman existence. End quote. Although primarily and especially afflicting the worker, who is less than a human being to the bourgeois, and who is exploited and used as mere material and mere chattel, the process of impoverishment of social relations and reification invests capitalist society as a whole. Quote, people regard each other only as useful objects, end quote. No one, not even the bourgeois, is spared. It is not a thesis restricted to the early works. In describing the horror of primitive capitalist accumulation, Capital invites readers to see what the bourgeoisie make of itself and of the laborer wherever it can, without restraint, model the world after its own image. The capitalist master is rooted in that alienation process and finds in his absolute satisfaction, whereas the worker, as his victim, stands from the outset in a relation of rebellion towards it and perceives it as a process of enslavement. Once victory has been obtained, however, the workers' rebellion ends up liberating capitalist boss himself from alienation. This also applies to individual reforms imposed by the workers' class struggle in the bourgeois society. In some respects, the reduction of the working day may prove beneficial for those who do everything in their power to prevent it. Let us recap. Quote, with suppressed irony and in very well weighted words, the factory inspectors hint that the actual law also frees the capitalist from some of the brutality natural to a man who is a mere embodiment of capital, and that it has given him time for a little culture. In other words, if the proletariat has material interests, as well as intellectual and moral one, in overthrowing capitalist class struggle, in the overthrowing capitalist class rule, individuals and sections of the exploiting class itself could develop an intellectual and moral interest in being rid of the existing order. This is a point stressed above all by Engels, who was himself a capitalist. To be precise, he suggested that the more far-sighted bourgeois could have an interest in the transformation of society that goes beyond the intellectual and moral level proper. Take the consequence in England of the terrible degradation of working class and popular districts, which were structured like ghettos. Attempts were made to conceal from the eye of the wealthy men and women of strong stomachs and weak nerves the misery and crime which form the complement of their wealth. But however sophisticated this hypocritical plan, this shameful method of construction, it could not erase the disfigurement of the urban landscape, which remained an eyesore for everyone. Hmm. Working class and popular district ghettos were also repugnant when it came to hygiene and hence were liable to epidemics. With the spread of cholera in Manchester, a universal terror seized the bourgeoisie of the city. People remembered the unwholesome dwellings of the poor and trembled before the certainty that each of these slums would become a center for the plague, whence it would spread desolation in all directions through the houses and property classes. Although reserving its most serious consequences for the workers, massed and confined in factories and unhealthy districts, the logic of capitalist profit reached general devastation. This also applies to other aspects of social existence. No one should be indifferent to the polarization of wealth and poverty inherent in bourgeois society. It was the source of the social war, the war of each against all, and in general insecurity which placed every man's house in a state of siege. In this case, too, the existing social order involved negative consequences for the dominant class itself. But to what extent could individual members of the capitalist bourgeoisie be held responsible? Having drawn attention to the ruinous consequences of the proletariat of the unbridled hunt for profits, capitalists feel the need to add, looking at things as a whole, all this does, got myself lost for a second. Having drawn attention to the ruinous consequences of the proletariat of the unbridled hunt for profit, capitals feels the need to add, quote, looking at things as a whole, all this does not indeed depend on the good or ill will of the individual capitalist. Free competition brings out the inherent laws of capitalist production in the shape of external coercive laws having power over every individual capitalist, end quote. While it mainly impacted upon the proletarian, the relation of compulsion between capital and labor did not spare the individual capitalist, likewise subject to the coercive law imposed on him from without. He was but one of the wheels of the social mechanism. Going yet further, the young Engels wrote that socialism/communism applies the principle of the irresponsibility of the individual when analyzed the modus operandi of the social order. For this very reason, the more the English worker absorbs communist ideas, the more superfluous becomes their present bitterness towards the oppressor as individuals, with a commensurate reduction in the violent charge for the anti-capitalist revolution. For Marx and Engels, it was a question of abolishing not only class exploitation in a single country, but also national oppression. And we once again encounter the baseline with which we are already familiar. While they primarily and directly address the oppressed, they not only call upon the proletariat of the oppressor country not to make common cause with the privileged classes, but did not even close the door to the most enlightened members of those classes. We shall find the thesis that the people which oppresses another people is not free repeatedly formulated. Like the social war inside a country, a fortiori, the latent or open state of war between peoples induces a more or less general state of emergency, and hence a restriction of liberty for the oppressors too. So it is overwhelmingly, so it is the overwhelming majority of humanity that has an interest in the impending social revolution. The section and members of the exploiting class and oppressor nation most inclined to theoretical study and moral reflection are invited not to lose sight of the grave practical drawbacks and general human devastation created by the social systems, of which they are nevertheless beneficiaries in immediate material terms. Being a communist certainly means appealing to the class struggle waged by the oppressed, internationally, nationally, and within the family, but it also means having developed the capacity to see things in the round. In this sense, the young Engels asserted that, quote, communism stands above the strife between bourgeoisie and proletariat, end quote, and thus was different from purely proletarian Chartism, which contains residues of corporatism. Marx against Nietzsche. Oh, I was gonna stop, but kind of want to know if I was way off. I think I think I was. I don't think that's where we're heading, but you know, still good to know what Marx against Nietzsche means and Foucault. All right, let's do it. Something remarkable has emerged. On the one hand, there is no escaping the class struggle. On the other hand, it has a tendency to transcend itself, pursuing and realizing objects liable to be universally welcomed. How is this possible? The authors of the Communist Manifesto evinced an ethos of reason and science throughout their careers. Truth is general. It does not belong to me alone. It belongs to all. It owns me. When he expressed himself thus in manifestly Hegelian accents, Marx was only 24 years old, but he remained loyal to this view to the end. Capital forcefully asserts that the outward appearance or delusion appearance of phenomena does not coincide with its essence, and hence a prolonged, laborious intellectual engagement was required to achieve scientific truth. Has conflict disappeared? That is not the point. The ethos of reason and scientific truth does not prevent Marx from stressing that in bourgeois society, science is pressed into the service of capital. The history and critique of the capital's employment of machinery and capital are precisely the history and critique of the capital's use of science. In 1854, Engels declared that he sought to respect the principle that military science, like mathematics or geography, has no particular political opinion. Obviously, in saying this, he was not unaware that military science played a key role in the class struggle, be it in wars between opposed capitalist bourgeois or civil wars and colonial wars. But those capable of analyzing and evaluating the logic, internal consistency, and efficacy of the various sciences could also condemn their utilization in the service of capitalism and colonialism or other causes. This is a discord that does not only hold good for the applied sciences, as is clear from their critique of what I have characterized as court enlightenment. Marx and Engels were perfectly well aware that reason and the light of reason can be employed to justify domination and oppression. However, this can be highlighted and refuted only through a new, more cogent and compelling recourse to reason and the light of reason. In other words, we are dealing with a critique of enlightenment very different from that which has found expression in our day in uh, Gadamer, Hans Georg Gadamer. He writes, quote, "The fundamental prejudice of the Enlightenment is the prejudice against prejudice itself. which denies tradition its power, end quote. In this way, Gadamer equates two very different attitudes. Appealing to reason and submitting to its control, Enlightenment prejudice is capable of challenging itself. Not so anti-Enlightenment prejudice. Reason can understand what is rational in prejudice and how much prejudice there is in the historically and socially determined forms taken by reason. Prejudice is incapable of an analogous operation. It refuses to submit itself and the tradition to which it pertains to the authority of reason. While for Gadamer everything is affected by prejudice, for Nietzsche everything is profoundly marked by conflict. No cultural expression can claim an even relative and partial autonomy. Take the science of physics, the attempt to discover in nature regularity, law, equality, the alleged conformity of nature to law, goes hand in hand with the alleged equality before the law. This is a nice example of the ulterior motives disguising once again the plebeian hostility against everything privileged and aristocratic. Ultimately, to cry long live natural law in the matter of the physicist is merely another way of crying ni Dieu ni maître, the manner of anarchists. I think this means no without God or masters or something like that. No gods or masters. Uh, in the matter of anarchists, indeed, modernity and the reasons cherished by it are characterized by resistance to every special claim and special right and privilege. The interpretation of philosophical and scientific arguments in an anti-aristocratic key is thus not as new as it might first seem. Let us glance at the intellectual tradition behind Marx. It was Kant who noted that rigorous universality, peculiar to reason, precluded any exception. In his turn, Hegel asserted that philosophy, as the science of reason, on account of the universal mode of its being and in accordance with its nature, is a science for everyone. Granted the difference, granted the different value judgment, Nietzsche concur with this thesis. He was not wrong to stress that the syllogism, dear to Socrates, is apparently merely a formal rule of discourse that does not pursue particular political objectives. In reality, however, inherent in recourse to the syllogism, to logical rational discourse in which all human beings can participate, in which is thereby distinguished from the esoteric, aristocratic revelation of a sapient truth, is the lethal plebeian knife thrust. That is to say, the syllogism or logical rational discourse is not politically more pure than sapient discourse. A comparison of these two types of discourse yields the same results as emerge from the contrast between two different types of prejudice, enlightenment and anti-enlightenment. Logical rational discourse is capable of refuting itself and understanding what might be valid in another kind of discourse. Sapient discourse is incapable of any such operation. Not coincidentally, in order to measure up to Socrates polemically, Nietzsche lapses into a performative contradiction. He seeks to demonstrate the beneficent character of aristocratic privilege by himself resorting to logical argument, which by definition places all interlocutors on the same level and excludes any privilege. Availing himself of logical rational arguments, the champion of aristocratic radicalism, in a sense, discredits sapient discourse and makes the plebeian knife thrust he condemns in Socrates. If Nietzsche runs into a blatant performative contradiction, how can Marx and Engels combine an ethos of class struggle with an ethos of reason and science? Reason can certainly be employed to justify privilege, domination, and oppression. Yet, as Nietzsche recognizes, inherent in it is the tendency to assert relations of equality and hence to delegitimize privilege, domination, and oppression. Emancipatory class struggle and reason have a tendency to converge. In addition, far from being the eternal clash between masters and slaves referred to by Nietzsche and Calhoun, class struggle involves a constant development and mutations. The result of this is what might be defined as processes of objectification. Although manifestly bound up with certain forms of social development, observes Marx, Greek art and epic poetry still gives us aesthetic pleasure and are in certain respect regarded as a standard and unattainable model. The political and social conflicts that inspire these masterpieces are now in the past. Not only does aesthetic enjoyment remain, however, but men and women from the most diverse social backgrounds and political positions partake of it or tend to. The process of objectification has occurred. This does not apply only to art. The Ptolemaic vision of the universe was refuted and defended during a bitter ideological confrontation. Yet even the heirs of those who condemned Galileo some centuries ago wound up identifying with heliocentrism. What was what has just been observed of the Ptolemaic system might easily be extended to the so-called donation of Constantine. The alleged testament of the Roman emperor, which legitimized the temporal power of the Catholic Church, is no longer taken seriously even by those most loyal to the Catholic Church. We might argue in similar fashion for the Socratic syllogism and science of physics targeted by Nietzsche. In our day, however, aristocratic, and however great its admiration for the philosopher of aristocratic radicalism, a political movement of government may affect an air of superiority towards the plebeianism of the syllogism, but it will find it difficult to badge physical science as anarchical. We might sum up Marx's viewpoint thus: everything is prey to conflict, but not in the same way, and in any event, not in a way that is immutable over time. However, we must go further if we wish to understand the relationship between reason and power established by the champion of aristocratic radicalism, on the one hand, and the theories of emancipatory class struggle on the other. Over and above reason, the former sought to challenge the concept of man as such. There is not and cannot be a community of the concept of reason because there is not and cannot be a human community in the true sense. The condemnation of the plebeian inherent in logical science, as in physical science, goes hand in hand in Nietzsche with the nominalistic construction of the universal concept of man, with the critique of the bloodless abstraction, man, that general pale fiction, with affirmations of the thesis that most are no one, and cannot be subsumed under the category of man or the individual, given what they are, bears tools of transmission, exactly like Aristotle's slaves. The opposite side is true for Marx. The ethos of the community of the concept and reason goes hand in hand with the ethos of human community, which is the inspiration for emancipatory class struggle. Okay. Okay. I have to read this again. Sorry. So, so for Nietzsche, over and above reason, the form for Nietzsche sought to challenge the concept of man as such. There is not and cannot be a community of the concept and reason because there is not and cannot be a human community in the true sense. The condemnation of the plebeianism inherent in logical science, as in physical science, goes hand in hand in Nietzsche with the nominalistic construction of the universal concept of man, with the critique of the bloodless abstraction man, that general pale fiction, with the affirmation of the thesis that most are no one and cannot be subsumed under the category of man or the individual, given that they are bearers, tools of transmission, exactly like Aristotle's slaves. And then for Marx, the ethos of the community of the concept and reason goes hand in hand with the ethos of human community, which is the inspiration for emancipatory class struggle. Hmm. That's, I mean, if this is right, it's one of yet another reason why I'm not sure that we can really find much emancipatory potential in Nietzsche, and why I'm confused by the whatever chunk of leftist Nietzsche and their inheritors like Foucault or Deleuze or whatever. if there is no, I don't know, like it seems like for any sort of emancipation, there has to be a level of community involved. But I don't know. I guess I'm with Marx on this one. That's what I'm trying to say. Assuming all this analysis is true, I don't know. Anyways, mm, moving on. Those one thinks particularly of Michel Foucault, who have discovered a more radical critique of domination in Nietzsche than Marx, who supposedly stopped halfway, as demonstrated by his genuine inflection of reason and science, argue in mistaken and misleading fashion. Okay, so I think that's where we're going. I'm not, I wasn't totally off. In reality, in the theorist of aristocratic radicalism, the non-transcendability of conflicted reason ultimately refers to the irreparable naturalistic rifts, splitting the human community into masters and slaves, successes and failures. Marx and Engels' attitude to the relationship between class struggle and reason proves all the more persuasive if we glance at the history of the political movement inspired by them. In the course of that history, prompted by the horror at the carnage of the First World War and the need to break radically with the past, a kind of spontaneous Foucaultianism avant la lettre emerged, which set off in search of power relations to unmask and condemn in any and every context. The result was far from positive. The direct identification of reason with domination encouraged the emergence of a hermeneutic of universal suspicion and greatly compromised the space of intersubjective communication. Ignoring its argumentative basis and logical structure, it interpreted any proposition as an expression of class struggle. Furthermore, the construction of post-capital society was rendered even more difficult by a microphysics of power that denounced the advent of new forms of power and domination in the regulation of any relationship or institution in the judicial order as such. This basically anarchistic attitude created an enormous void without rules, which could only be filled by direct violence and the indefinite continuation of the direct violence contained in the revolution. Oh my gosh. I wonder if there's more about this coming up. Yes. Let's see. So the next chapter, I'm not gonna read anymore, but I'm just gonna go see what's coming up. So class struggle, redistribution, recognition, positive humans, and the creature the shortcomings of natural law. Hegel, Marx, and the paradigm of the struggle for recognition, the struggle for recognition. Okay, don't think we hit on this anymore. Overcoming binary unfinished mutilation of the class struggle, imperial socialism, binary logic, self-evidence, class struggle, or the struggle between oppressor and oppressed. Okay, well, I mean, no matter what, a lot of interesting stuff is coming out, but um, I'm curious about this in particular. Okay, ranking of class struggles, Southeast Passage. Lenin is critical of mutilation of the class struggle. Mao. Hmm. Oh, we're gonna touch on our rent. Okay, well, that's it for now. I will do the next one soon.